From the harsh deserts of Persia came an empire that shouldn't have existed. How did it rise so fast, and what finally brought it down? Watch till the end, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Chapter 1. The Land of Kings. Before Persia became a name that echoed across continents, it was simply a land, vast, rugged, and unyielding. The Iranian plateau stretched beneath an endless sky, a place of extremes where towering mountains met dry deserts and fertile valleys appeared like rare gifts carved into a harsh world. It was not a land that offered comfort. It demanded resilience. Life here was never easy. The winters could freeze the earth into silence, while the summers burned it beneath an unforgiving sun. Water was scarce in many regions, and survival depended on understanding the rhythms of nature. Those who lived on this land did not conquer it, they adapted to it. Over time, the land shaped the people just as much as they shaped it. Long before there were kings or empires, tribes moved across this terrain. They were nomadic, following seasonal patterns, searching for water, pasture, and stability in a world that rarely provided it. Their lives were defined by motion and necessity. There was no central authority, no unified identity, only scattered groups bound by survival and tradition. Among these tribes were the early Persians. At first, they were not powerful. They did not command vast armies or rule over cities. They existed alongside other peoples, often overshadowed by stronger and more organized kingdoms. To the west, the Medes had begun to establish control over large territories. To the south, older civilizations had already risen, leaving behind structures and systems that hinted at what organized power could achieve. The Persians were observers in this world. They watched, they learned, they endured. The environment itself became their greatest teacher. It instilled discipline, patience, and an understanding that strength was not a matter of force alone, but of persistence. Over generations, these qualities became part of their identity. They were no longer just surviving the land, they were being shaped by it into something capable of more. Gradually, subtle changes began to take place. The idea of unity, once distant and unfamiliar, started to emerge. Tribes that had long existed independently began forming alliances, recognizing that cooperation could provide advantages that isolation could not. These were not yet permanent unions, but they marked a shift in thinking, a movement towards something larger than individual survival. The Medes offered a clear example of what such unity could achieve. Their kingdom demonstrated how power could be organized, how leadership could extend beyond a single tribe, and how territory could be controlled rather than merely inhabited. For the Persians, this was more than a neighboring reality. It was a possibility. For a time, the Persians lived under Median influence. This position, though subordinate, provided valuable insight. They saw how authority functioned, how decisions were made, and how power could be maintained across distance. They observed not only the strengths of such a system, but also its limitations. These lessons would prove essential, because potential alone does not create an empire. It requires direction. It requires leadership. It requires a moment when everything that has been learned is brought together and transformed into action. At this stage, that moment had not yet arrived. The Persians were still a people in formation, shaped by their environment and influenced by the world around them. But the conditions were changing. The land had forged resilience. Experience had provided knowledge. The first steps toward unity had begun. All that remained was a catalyst, someone who could see beyond the present and recognize what the future could become. The world did not yet know Persia as a force of power and influence. It did not yet recognize that from this harsh and demanding land would rise an empire that would stretch across continents, connecting cultures and redefining governance. But the foundation had been laid. Quietly, gradually, inevitably, because history often begins not with sudden transformation but with slow preparation, with a land that shapes its people, with a people who learn to endure, and with the steady accumulation of strength that, when the moment comes, cannot be contained. The Iranian plateau remained as it had always been, vast, demanding, and unchanging. But the people upon it were no longer the same, and soon neither would the world beyond it. Chapter 2. Rise of Cyrus the Great. Empires do not begin with armies. They begin with a man. Not always the strongest, not always the most feared, but the one who sees further than others and acts when the moment arrives. For the Persians, that man was Cyrus. He was not born into an empire. He inherited a people still shaping their identity, still living under the shadow of the Medes. His lineage connected him to leadership, but it did not guarantee power. The world he entered was already defined by others, by established kingdoms, by systems that had existed long before his name would ever be spoken. And yet, from the beginning, there was something different about him. Cyrus did not simply accept the structure he was born into. He studied it. He understood it. He recognized both its strength and its weaknesses. The Medes, who once represented unity and dominance in the region, had grown powerful. But power, when held for too long without challenge, begins to change. It becomes rigid, predictable, vulnerable in ways that are not always visible to those who hold it. Cyrus saw this. Where others saw authority, he saw opportunity. Where others saw stability, he saw cracks forming beneath the surface. But vision alone does not create change. It must be matched with action. And action, in a world of kings and armies, carries risk. Cyrus began not with open rebellion but with preparation. He strengthened his position among the Persians, building loyalty, establishing trust, creating a foundation that could support something larger. Leadership for him was not about force alone. It was about connection, about bringing people together under a shared purpose. This was not the way power had always been exercised. But it was effective, because people will follow strength, but they will commit to vision. As his influence grew, so did his confidence in what could be achieved. The Persians, once a subordinate force, were no longer content to remain in that position. The idea of independence, of self-determination, of becoming something greater, began to take hold. And once an idea takes root, it is difficult to contain. The moment came when Cyrus chose to act. Not cautiously, not partially, but completely. He challenged the Medes, not just their authority, but the system they had built. This was not a small decision. It was a turning point, a movement from potential into reality, a step that once taken could not be undone. The conflict that followed was not simply a battle between two groups. It was a transformation. The Persians under Cyrus fought not as scattered tribes but as a unified force. Their strength was not just in numbers or weapons but in cohesion, in belief, in the understanding that they were fighting not just against something but for something. And that difference matters, because an army driven by purpose is not easily broken. The Medes, despite their power, were not prepared for this kind of challenge. Their structure, once an advantage, became a limitation. Their assumptions about control, about loyalty, about stability began to fail. Momentum shifted, gradually at first, then completely. Cyrus did not simply defeat the Medes. He absorbed them. This was perhaps his greatest strength. Where others might have destroyed, he integrated. He recognized that power could be expanded not only by conquest, but by inclusion. The Median system, their knowledge, their administrative structures, all became part of what Cyrus was building. This was not the end of one kingdom and the beginning of another. It was something new, something larger, the foundation of an empire. For the first time, the Persians were no longer defined by the influence of others. They had become the center of power. Their identity, once shaped by survival and observation, was now defined by action and control. Cyrus did not stop, because the creation of an empire is not a single event. It is a process. Each success creates new possibilities. Each expansion reveals new challenges. The world beyond the Iranian plateau was vast, filled with kingdoms that had their own histories, their own strengths, their own ambitions. And Cyrus intended to face them. But what set him apart was not just his ability to conquer. It was his ability to govern. He understood that an empire built only on force is fragile. It requires constant pressure, constant conflict, constant reinforcement. But an empire built on structure, on cooperation, on a system that allows different peoples to exist within it, has the potential to endure. This understanding would define everything that followed. Because Cyrus was not just creating power, he was shaping how that power would function. His rise marked a turning point not only for the Persians, but for the world around them. The balance of power shifted. The assumptions about what was possible began to change. A people who had once been seen as secondary had become dominant. And they were only beginning. The name Cyrus would come to carry weight far beyond his own lifetime. It would represent not just conquest, but transformation. Not just victory, but vision. Because in a world where empires rose and fell through force alone, Cyrus introduced something different. The idea that power could expand without erasing. That control could exist alongside respect. That an empire could be vast and still function. But all of that lay ahead. For now, there was only the rise. The moment when a man looked at the world as it was and chose to change it. And in doing so, set into motion a force that would reshape history itself. Chapter 3. The Fall of the Medes. Power rarely collapses in a single moment. It weakens first. Quietly, almost invisibly. The Medes had once stood as the dominant force across the region, their authority stretching over lands that had previously been divided and uncertain. They had achieved what many could not: unity, structure, control. For a time, they were the example others observed, the standard by which power was measured. But power, when it stabilizes, begins to change. It becomes comfortable. And comfort creates blind spots. The Median system, though strong, had grown rigid. Its leadership relied on established authority, on the assumption that loyalty would continue because it always had. The mechanisms that once created expansion now focused on maintaining what already existed. And in that shift, something was lost. Adaptability. Cyrus understood this. He had not rushed into conflict without reason. His challenge to Median rule was not based on ambition alone, but on recognition. He saw that the structure holding the Medes together was no longer as strong as it appeared. Beneath the surface, tensions had begun to form. Allies were no longer as loyal. Commanders were no longer as certain. The idea of unshakable authority was beginning to fade. When the conflict began, it was not simply a clash of armies. It was a test of systems. The Persians under Cyrus moved with purpose. Their strength was not just in their willingness to fight, but in their unity. They were no longer fragmented tribes brought together by necessity. They were a force shaped by a shared vision. The Medes, by contrast, carried the weight of their own structure. What had once made them powerful now slowed them. Decisions were bound by expectation. Movements were predictable. Confidence, once an advantage, became a liability. As the campaigns unfolded, the balance began to shift. The Persians advanced with increasing momentum, while the Medes struggled to respond with the same clarity they once possessed. Battles were fought, positions taken, ground lost and regained. But beneath the visible conflict, something deeper was happening. The belief in Median dominance was weakening. And belief is the foundation of power. Without it, even the strongest systems begin to fracture. There are moments in history when the outcome of a conflict becomes inevitable before the final battle is fought, when the direction has already been decided, even if the conclusion has not yet been reached. This was one of those moments. The final collapse of Median power did not come as a sudden shock. It came as a realization. The capital, Ecbatana, once a symbol of authority and control, became the focal point. Its walls had stood as a representation of strength, of permanence. But walls alone cannot hold power when the system behind them has already begun to fail. Cyrus approached not just as a conqueror, but as something more. He understood that victory was not simply about destruction. It was about transition. When Ecbatana fell, it did not mark the end of a people. It marked the end of a structure. The Medes were not erased. They were absorbed. This decision would define Cyrus in ways that set him apart from other rulers. Where many would have chosen to eliminate their rivals to secure power through removal, he chose integration. The Median elite, their knowledge, their administrative systems, were not discarded. They became part of something larger. This was not mercy alone. It was strategy. Because an empire built on destruction must constantly rebuild. An empire built on integration grows stronger with each addition. The fall of the Medes, therefore, was not simply a victory. It was a transformation. For the Persians, it marked the moment when they ceased to be a rising force and became a dominant one. The shift was complete. They were no longer defined by the influence of others. They were now the center around which others would move. For the Medes, it was a change in identity, from rulers to contributors, from the dominant power to a foundational element within a greater system. And for the world beyond, it was a signal. A new power had emerged, one that did not follow the same patterns as those before it, one that did not rely solely on conquest, but on the ability to reshape what it conquered. The fall of the Medes was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of something far more significant. Because with their victory, the Persians had gained more than territory. They had gained experience, structure, confidence, and most importantly, momentum. And momentum, once established, is difficult to stop. Cyrus had proven that the impossible was achievable, that a people once considered secondary could rise, challenge, and replace an established power. But this was only the first step. Beyond the lands of the Medes lay kingdoms that were older, richer, more complex. Civilizations that had stood for generations, that had built their own systems of power and believed them to be secure. They had not yet faced Cyrus. They had not yet seen what the Persians had become. But they would, because the fall of one empire does not create peace. It creates opportunity. And Cyrus intended to take it. Chapter 4. Conquest of Lydia and Babylon. Victory changes a man. It confirms what was once uncertain. It transforms possibility into proof. After the fall of the Medes, Cyrus was no longer a challenger. He was a ruler of a growing empire, a force that could not be ignored. But power once gained demands direction. To the west lay Lydia, a kingdom unlike those Cyrus had faced before. Wealth defined it. Gold flowed through its cities, its markets, its courts. Its king, Croesus, was known not for conquest alone, but for riches that seemed without limit. Lydia was stable, prosperous, and confident. Perhaps too confident. Croesus had watched the rise of Cyrus with concern. The fall of the Medes had shifted the balance of power, bringing a new and unpredictable force closer to his borders. But instead of waiting, he chose to act. It was a decision shaped by caution and miscalculation. The campaign began as a test. Croesus moved east, seeking to strike before Cyrus could fully consolidate his strength. It was a calculated risk, based on the belief that the Persians, though rising, were not yet unstoppable. But Cyrus responded with speed and with clarity. The conflict that followed did not unfold as Croesus had expected. Initial engagements gave way to something more decisive. Cyrus did not retreat, he pursued, relentlessly. The battlefield shifted, momentum built, and Croesus, who had once moved with confidence, found himself responding instead of directing. The final confrontation came at Sardis, the Lydian capital, a city of wealth, of security, of long-standing power. Its walls had protected it for generations. Its position had seemed unassailable. But no position is absolute. Cyrus adapted. He found ways to overcome defenses that others had accepted as permanent. The city fell not through overwhelming force alone, but through persistence, through strategy, through the refusal to accept limits. With the fall of Sardis, Lydia collapsed. Its wealth became Persian. Its systems became Persian. Its identity transformed. But once again, Cyrus did not destroy what he conquered. He absorbed it. Croesus, according to tradition, was not executed but spared. Whether as an act of mercy, strategy, or both, the decision reflected a pattern. Cyrus understood that power could be strengthened by preserving what was valuable. Lydia's resources, its knowledge, its position, all became part of the expanding empire. The West had been secured, but Cyrus was not finished. To the south lay something greater. Babylon, an ancient city, older than most kingdoms, rich in history, culture, and power. Its walls were legendary, its influence vast. It was not simply a city. It was a symbol. To challenge Babylon was to confront one of the greatest powers of the ancient world. But Cyrus moved toward it without hesitation. The approach to Babylon was not defined by immediate conflict. Unlike previous campaigns, this was not a straightforward march to battle. Babylon was fortified, prepared, confident in its defenses. And yet within that confidence, there were weaknesses, internal divisions, discontent, a system that, like others before it, had begun to rely too heavily on its own reputation. Cyrus understood this. He did not rely solely on force. He used strategy. The details of Babylon's fall would be remembered in different ways. Some spoke of diversion, of rivers redirected, of pathways opened where none were expected. Others emphasized the role of internal support, of a population not entirely committed to defending its rulers. Whatever the method, the result was the same. Babylon fell, and with it, one of the greatest symbols of ancient power passed into Persian control. But what followed was as significant as the conquest itself. Cyrus entered Babylon not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. He respected its traditions, honored its gods, allowed its people to continue their lives with minimal disruption. This was not the behavior of a conqueror driven solely by domination. It was the action of a ruler who understood something deeper. That legitimacy matters. That power to endure must be accepted. By integrating Babylon rather than breaking it, Cyrus secured not just territory, but loyalty. The city became part of the empire not through fear alone, but through a sense of continuity. This approach would define the Persian system, a model of governance that allowed different cultures, religions, and traditions to exist within a larger structure. It was not uniformity. It was controlled diversity. And it worked. With Lydia and Babylon under his control, Cyrus had achieved something extraordinary. His empire now stretched across regions that had once been separate, connecting lands through a single authority. Trade expanded. Communication improved. The idea of a unified system began to take shape. But expansion brings new challenges. The larger the empire, the more complex it becomes. Managing distance, maintaining control, ensuring stability, all require more than victory. They require structure. And while Cyrus had proven his ability to conquer, the question remained: could this growing empire be sustained? For now, the answer seemed clear. Momentum continued. Confidence grew. The world, once divided into separate powers, was being reshaped into something new. An empire that did not simply replace others, but absorbed them, transformed them, connected them. Cyrus had moved from the fall of the Medes to the wealth of Lydia, to the ancient strength of Babylon, each step expanding his reach, each victory reinforcing his vision. But the horizon still stretched further, and beyond it lay more lands, more challenges, more opportunities. Because for Cyrus, conquest was not an end. It was a path, and he intended to follow it as far as it would go. Chapter 5. The Birth of an Empire. Power once expanded demands order. What Cyrus had built through conquest now stretched across vast distances, lands that spoke different languages, followed different traditions, and lived under different systems long before his rise. From the mountains of the Iranian plateau to the wealthy cities of Lydia, from the ancient heart of Babylon to the edges of lands still unknown, the empire was no longer a single region. It was a world, and a world cannot be held together by force alone. This was the moment where many conquerors failed. Victory is immediate. Control is not. To rule an empire of such scale required more than strength. It required structure, vision, and an understanding that power must evolve if it is to endure. Cyrus did not see the lands he had conquered as territories to be dominated endlessly through fear. He saw them as parts of a greater whole, pieces of a system that, if managed correctly, could function as one. This was the beginning of something new. Not just expansion, but organization. Cyrus allowed the regions under his control to retain much of their identity. Local leaders were often kept in place, traditions respected, religions left undisturbed. This was not weakness, it was calculation. By preserving what people already trusted, he reduced resistance. By respecting what they valued, he gained something far more powerful than obedience. He gained acceptance, and acceptance creates stability. The empire began to take shape not as a uniform structure, but as a network. Each region connected to the center, yet allowed to function in its own way. This flexibility became one of the defining strengths of Persian rule. It allowed diversity without losing control. It created a system that could expand without collapsing under its own weight. But even a flexible system needs authority. Cyrus established a clear sense of leadership. The king was not distant, he was central, the source of power, the figure through whom the empire was defined. Yet his authority was not expressed through constant force. It was reinforced through consistency, through fairness, through the visible benefits of being part of something larger. Trade routes expanded under his rule. Goods moved more freely across regions that had once been separated by borders and conflict. Wealth increased, not just in the center but throughout the empire. Communication improved, allowing information to travel faster, decisions to be made more effectively. These were not small changes. They were foundational. Because an empire is not sustained by conquest. It is sustained by function. And under Cyrus, the Persian Empire began to function as a unified system. But unity does not eliminate challenge. Distance remained an issue. The further the empire expanded, the more difficult it became to maintain direct control. Messages took time to travel. Decisions could not always be made instantly. The possibility of rebellion, of fragmentation, of loss always existed. Cyrus understood this. He did not attempt to control everything personally. Instead, he created layers of authority. Trusted individuals were given responsibility over regions, acting in the name of the king while managing local affairs. This delegation was not a loss of power, it was an extension of it. It allowed the empire to operate beyond the physical presence of its ruler. It allowed it to grow. And growth continued. But alongside expansion came the need for identity. What was this empire? What defined it? It was no longer simply Persian. It included Medes, Lydians, Babylonians, and countless others. Different cultures, different histories, all now part of a single structure. Cyrus did not attempt to erase these differences. He embraced them. The empire was not defined by sameness. It was defined by connection. This approach set it apart from many that had come before. Where others sought to impose a single identity, Cyrus created a system where multiple identities could exist under one authority. It was complex. It required balance, but it worked. Because people do not resist what they feel part of. And Cyrus made them part of something larger. His reputation grew not just as a conqueror but as a ruler. Stories spread of his decisions, his policies, his approach to power. He became known not only for what he had taken, but for how he governed what he held. This distinction mattered. It transformed perception, and perception shapes legacy. By the time the foundations of the empire were firmly established, it was clear that something unprecedented had been created. This was not a temporary dominance, not a fleeting expansion driven by a single campaign. It was a system, a structure designed to endure. The birth of the Persian Empire was not marked by a single event. It was defined by this transition, from conquest to control, from expansion to organization, from power to governance. And at its center stood Cyrus, a ruler who understood that the true measure of an empire is not how far it reaches, but how well it holds together. Yet even as the empire stabilized, the horizon remained. Unexplored lands, unclaimed power, unfinished ambition. Because empires once born do not remain still. They either grow or they begin to decline. And under Cyrus, growth was still the path forward. Chapter 6. Cambyses and Egypt. Empires do not pause when their founders are gone. They continue, or they begin to fracture. When Cyrus died, the empire he had built did not collapse. It stood, vast, connected, powerful, but its future was no longer certain. The system he had created was strong, yet still young. It required leadership that could maintain momentum, preserve stability, and prove that the empire was more than the vision of one man. That responsibility fell to his son, Cambyses. He inherited not just territory, but expectation. The weight of an empire already stretching across regions, the legacy of a ruler who had reshaped the world, and the question that follows every great leader. What comes next? For Cambyses, the answer lay to the south. Egypt, an ancient land older than most civilizations, defined by the Nile and sustained by it. Its cities, its temples, its traditions, all spoke of continuity, of a culture that had endured for centuries. Egypt was not simply another kingdom. It was a symbol of permanence. To conquer, it was not just to gain territory. It was to claim legitimacy on a different scale. Cambyses understood this. The campaign toward Egypt was not rushed. It required preparation, coordination, and an understanding of terrain very different from the lands Persia had already absorbed. Deserts, river systems, and fortified positions presented challenges that could not be approached in the same way as before. But the empire had grown. Its resources had expanded. Its reach had increased. And with that, its capability. When the confrontation came, it was decisive. The Persian forces, carrying the momentum built under Cyrus, moved with confidence. The Egyptian defenses, though strong, were not enough to withstand the scale and organization of the advancing army. The battle at Pelusium became the turning point, a moment where resistance faltered and the path to the heart of Egypt opened. Memphis followed, and with it control. Egypt, the land of pharaohs, became part of the Persian Empire. But conquest alone does not secure a region like Egypt. Its identity was deeply rooted, its traditions central to its people. To rule it required more than victory. It required adaptation. Cambyses took on the role of pharaoh, not as an outsider imposing authority, but as a continuation of a system that already existed. He adopted the titles, the symbolism, the expectations associated with Egyptian kingship. This was not abandonment of Persian identity. It was extension, a recognition that power must sometimes take different forms to remain effective. Yet the rule of Cambyses did not carry the same balance that had defined Cyrus. Where Cyrus had integrated with careful precision, Cambyses' approach was more forceful, more direct. His campaigns extended beyond Egypt, reaching into lands that offered less stability, less immediate value. Expeditions into Nubia and attempts toward the west stretched the empire's resources and exposed its limits. And limits, when tested too aggressively, respond. These campaigns did not achieve the same success as the conquest of Egypt. The environment was harsher, the conditions more difficult, supply lines stretched thin. What had once been momentum began to slow. At the same time, internal pressures began to build. The empire, now larger than ever, required careful management. Communication across such distances was never immediate. Authority, when spread too far, becomes harder to maintain with precision. Small uncertainties, small disruptions begin to grow. Cambyses ruled over a system that was expanding faster than it could fully stabilize. And within that system, tension formed. Stories of his rule would later be told in different ways. Some described harshness, others instability. Whether exaggerated or not, they reflected a shift in perception. The image of the ruler was changing. And in an empire, perception matters as much as reality. Because authority depends not only on control, but on belief. As Cambyses remained away from the core regions, focused on distant campaigns, the center of the empire began to feel the strain. Distance created gaps. Gaps created uncertainty. And uncertainty invites challenge. The unity that had been carefully built under Cyrus was no longer as solid as it once appeared. It was not breaking, but it was being tested. Cambyses' reign demonstrated something essential about empires. Expansion is not the same as stability. Growth must be matched with control, with structure, with the ability to maintain what has already been gained. Without that balance, even the strongest systems begin to show weakness. And weakness does not go unnoticed. By the time Cambyses' rule approached its end, the empire stood at a crossroads. It was larger than ever, more powerful than any force around it. But it was also more complex, more difficult to manage, more vulnerable to disruption. The question was no longer whether the Persian Empire could expand. It had proven that it could. The question was whether it could endure, whether it could adapt to its own scale, whether it could transform from a growing power into a lasting one. Cambyses had extended the reach of the empire. He had added one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world to its domain. But in doing so, he had also revealed the challenges that came with such ambition. And those challenges were not going away. They were building, waiting, for the next ruler to either control them or be controlled by them. Chapter 7. Darius the Great, Order and Power. Empires are not tested in their rise. They are tested in their uncertainty. After the reign of Cambyses, the Persian Empire stood vast, but unsettled. Its borders stretched across continents, its influence unmatched. Yet beneath that scale, something had shifted. Stability was no longer guaranteed. Authority was no longer unquestioned. Whispers turned into doubt, doubt into unrest, and unrest into challenge. This was the moment when an empire could fracture or be reforged. From that uncertainty emerged Darius. He was not the obvious heir in the way Cyrus had been. His rise was not a simple continuation, but a response to instability. The empire needed more than a ruler. It needed control, clarity, and structure strong enough to hold together everything that had been built. Darius understood this. Where others might have focused on reclaiming authority through force alone, he looked deeper. He saw that the empire's greatest weakness was not its enemies, but its complexity. Too vast, too diverse, too dependent on distant control. If it was to survive, it needed to change. His first actions were decisive. Rebellions were confronted, resistance suppressed, authority reestablished. These were necessary steps, not just to secure power, but to send a message. The empire still held. The center still commanded. The system, though shaken, had not collapsed. But Darius did not stop at restoring control. He rebuilt it. The Persian Empire under Darius became something more organized, more precise, more structured than it had ever been. He divided the empire into regions, administrative units that could be managed more effectively, each governed by trusted officials, responsible for maintaining order, collecting tribute, and ensuring that the will of the king extended to every corner. This was not fragmentation. It was refinement, because true control does not come from holding everything tightly. It comes from creating systems that hold themselves. Darius established balance within this structure. Authority was distributed but never absolute outside the king. Officials were watched, monitored, and held accountable. Power was given, but never without oversight. This created stability, and stability created confidence. But governance requires more than administration. It requires connection. Darius understood that an empire cannot function if its parts are isolated. Distance, which had once been a challenge, had to be reduced, not physically but operationally. Communication needed to be faster. Movement needed to be easier. So he built roads. Not simple paths, but networks that connected the empire from one end to the other. Routes that allowed messengers to travel with unprecedented speed, carrying orders, information, decisions across vast distances. The royal road became more than infrastructure. It became a symbol of unity, of control, of an empire that could move as one, even across continents. Trade followed these routes. Goods moved more freely. Wealth increased, not just in the center, but across regions. Markets expanded. Exchange became easier. The empire was no longer just a political structure. It was an economic system. Darius introduced standardization, weights, measures, currency. These changes may have seemed small compared to conquest, but their impact was profound. They created consistency in a world that had once been fragmented. They allowed different regions to operate within the same framework. This was not just governance. It was integration. And with integration came strength. Yet Darius did not ignore the importance of identity. The empire was vast and diverse, filled with peoples who had their own traditions, beliefs, and histories. Rather than erase these differences, he maintained the approach that had begun under Cyrus. Respect. Local customs were preserved. Religions were allowed to continue. Temples were not destroyed but supported. This was not tolerance for its own sake. It was strategy, because people are less likely to resist what they do not feel threatened by. And an empire that minimizes resistance endures longer. At the center of it all stood the king. Darius did not diminish the authority of the throne. He elevated it. The image of the ruler became more defined, more powerful, more symbolic. Inscriptions, monuments, and architecture reinforced this presence. The king was not just a leader. He was the embodiment of the empire itself. This balance between centralized authority and distributed governance became the defining feature of Darius' rule. Order, power, control without constant force. Under him, the Persian Empire reached a level of organization that transformed it from a growing power into a functioning superpower of the ancient world. But structure does not eliminate ambition. With stability came the desire to expand further, to push beyond existing boundaries, to test the limits of what had been built. The empire, now stronger internally, began to look outward once again, toward lands that had not yet been absorbed, toward civilizations that had not yet been challenged, toward a world that was still divided. Darius had restored the empire, strengthened it, redefined it, but in doing so, he had also set the stage for its next phase. Because once an empire achieves order, it begins to seek dominance. And beyond the borders of Persia, there were powers that would not submit easily. The balance Darius had created would soon be tested, not from within, but from beyond. Chapter 8. The Persian System. Power can conquer, but only a system can sustain. By the time Darius had secured the empire, it was no longer defined by expansion alone. It had become something far more complex, vast, interconnected, and dependent on balance. The question was no longer how to grow. It was how to hold everything together. Because an empire of such scale cannot rely on constant presence. A king cannot stand in every city, command every army, judge every dispute. Without structure, distance becomes weakness. Without organization, diversity becomes division. Darius understood this with precision. What he created was not just governance. It was a system. The empire was divided into regions, each carefully defined, each assigned responsibility. These were not independent kingdoms but administrative units, controlled, monitored, and integrated into the larger structure. At the head of each stood a governor, entrusted with authority, yet never fully beyond the reach of the king. This balance was deliberate. Power was given, but never completely, because absolute control in the hands of many leads to fragmentation, and fragmentation leads to collapse. To prevent this, Darius introduced oversight. Officials were not left unchecked. They were observed, reported on, evaluated. The system watched itself, creating layers of accountability that extended across the empire. This was control without constant force. And it worked. Taxation became organized. Each region contributed according to its capacity, not through random demand but through structured obligation. This created predictability, stability, a flow of resources that could sustain the empire without exhausting it. Gold and silver moved through defined channels. Wealth became measurable. And what can be measured can be controlled. Trade expanded under this system. Roads connected distant lands, allowing merchants to travel further, faster, and with greater security. The royal road, stretching across the empire, became the backbone of communication and exchange. Messages that once took weeks could now move in days. Decisions could be enforced across vast distances. The empire was no longer slowed by its own size. It was strengthened by it. Markets grew. Goods flowed. Ideas traveled. The Persian Empire became not just a political entity, but an economic network, one that connected cultures, regions, and peoples in ways that had rarely existed before. Standardization played a critical role. Weights and measures were unified. Currency was introduced in a consistent form. Transactions became simpler, more reliable. This reduced confusion, increased trust, and allowed commerce to flourish across boundaries that had once divided regions. This was not a minor change. It was transformation, because trade is more than exchange. It is connection, and connection creates unity. But a system is not only built on movement and resources. It is built on people. The Persian approach to governance remained consistent with what Cyrus had established. Diversity was not eliminated, it was incorporated. Each region retained its customs, its traditions, its identity. The empire did not demand uniformity. It demanded loyalty. This distinction mattered, because people who feel respected are less likely to resist. And an empire that reduces resistance reduces the need for force. Religion, too, was treated with care. Temples were preserved. Beliefs were allowed to continue. The king did not position himself as a destroyer of cultures, but as a protector of order. This created legitimacy, not just through power, but through perception. The ruler was not seen only as a conqueror, but as a stabilizer. At the center of this system remained the authority of the king. Everything flowed outward from that point. Decisions, commands, structure. Yet the strength of the system was that it did not depend on the constant presence of that authority. It functioned independently, guided by rules, supported by infrastructure, reinforced by oversight. This allowed the empire to endure beyond moments of crisis, beyond individual leadership, beyond the limitations of distance. It became something larger than a single ruler. A machine, precise, coordinated, resilient. But even the strongest systems have limits. Complexity introduces vulnerability. The more interconnected something becomes, the more it relies on every part functioning correctly. A failure in one region can affect another. A disruption in communication can slow response. A breakdown in trust can spread. Darius had built a system designed to minimize these risks, but not eliminate them, because no system is perfect, and no empire is immune to challenge. Still, at its height, the Persian system represented something unprecedented, a model of governance that combined flexibility with control, diversity with unity, authority with structure. It was not built on chaos. It was built on order. And order creates power. The Persian Empire was no longer just expanding. It was operating, functioning, thriving. But as it reached this level of stability, something inevitable began to emerge. Ambition. Because once an empire masters control within its borders, it begins to look beyond them, toward lands not yet connected, toward powers not yet integrated, toward challenges that will test not just its strength, but its system. And soon, that system would face its greatest test yet. Not from within, but from a world that refused to be absorbed. Chapter 9. The Immortals and Military Power. An empire may be built on vision, but it is secured by force. For all its systems, its roads, its structure and governance, the Persian Empire understood a simple truth: power must be defended, order must be enforced, and expansion, when necessary, must be carried out with precision. Behind the stability of the empire stood its military. Not chaotic, not disorganized, but disciplined, structured, and deliberate. At the heart of this force was a unit that would come to define Persian strength: The Immortals. They were not named for myth alone, but for the way they appeared in battle. Their number never seemed to change. When one fell, another stepped forward. Always 10,000, always complete. To those who faced them, it was as if they could not be diminished, as if they could not be broken. This illusion was intentional, because perception is a weapon. The Immortals were more than elite soldiers. They were a symbol of continuity, of reliability, of unshakable presence. Chosen for their skill, their discipline, their loyalty, they formed the core of the Persian army. Their equipment was distinct: shields, spears, bows, balanced for both defense and offense. But what set them apart was not just their appearance. It was their consistency. They moved as one, fought as one, held the line when others could not. Yet the Persian military was not defined by a single unit. It was an extension of the empire itself, diverse, adaptable, composed of many different peoples. Soldiers from across the empire brought their own styles, their own weapons, their own experience. This created a force that was not uniform but flexible. It could adapt to different terrains, different enemies, different conditions. Cavalry, infantry, archers, each played a role. Together, they formed a system of warfare that relied not on a single method, but on coordination, on understanding how different elements could work together to create advantage. This was not brute force. It was controlled force. Command structure reinforced this control. Orders flowed clearly, hierarchies were defined, responsibilities understood. The army did not rely on individual heroism alone, but on organized execution. Because in large-scale warfare, discipline wins. The Persian army also benefited from the empire's infrastructure. Roads allowed for faster movement of troops. Supplies could be transported more efficiently. Communication between regions ensured that forces could be deployed where they were needed most. This connection between system and military was critical. An army without support weakens. An army supported by an empire sustains. Yet power is not only about strength. It is about presence. The Persian military was not always used to destroy. Often, its existence alone was enough to maintain order. The knowledge that force could be applied, that resistance would be met with organized response, discouraged rebellion before it began. This reduced the need for constant conflict and preserved resources. But when conflict did come, the army was ready. Campaigns were planned, not rushed. Terrain was studied. Opponents understood. The goal was not reckless engagement but calculated victory. This approach had allowed Persia to expand rapidly, to defeat established powers, to maintain control over vast lands. Yet even the strongest military faces limits. Distance remains a challenge. The further an army moves from its base, the more it depends on supply, communication, coordination. The larger the empire, the more fronts it must be prepared to defend. And beyond the borders of Persia, there were regions that did not operate within the same system. Regions where unity was not imposed, where independence was valued, where resistance was not easily controlled. The Persian military had faced kingdoms. It had faced empires. But soon it would face something different. A collection of city-states. Small, divided, but fiercely independent. And unlike previous enemies, they would not be absorbed easily. They would resist, not with the scale of Persia, but with determination. And sometimes, determination is enough to change the outcome of history. The Immortals stood ready. The armies remained strong. The empire was at its height. But for the first time, the question was not whether Persia could conquer. It was whether it could overcome a different kind of resistance, one that could not be defeated by numbers alone. one that would test not just the strength of the army, but the limits of the empire itself. Chapter 10. War with Greece begins. Empires expand until they meet resistance. For Persia, that resistance lay to the west. Beyond the vast systems of control, beyond the lands already absorbed into its structure, there existed a region unlike any it had encountered before. Not a unified kingdom, not a centralized empire, but a collection of city-states. Independent, divided, yet bound by something less visible and harder to control. Identity. The Greek world did not operate under a single authority. Each city had its own leadership, its own priorities, its own rivalries. They competed with one another, disagreed, conflicted. To an empire like Persia, this fragmentation might have seemed like weakness. But it was something else. It was unpredictability. And unpredictability is difficult to conquer. The connection between Persia and the Greek world had already begun through the Ionian cities along the coast of Asia Minor. These cities, though Greek in culture, had come under Persian control. At first, the arrangement followed the familiar pattern. Local structures remained, authority was extended, the system absorbed them. But not completely, because identity does not always adapt as easily as governance. The Ionian revolt marked the first clear sign of resistance. What began as unrest grew into open defiance. Greek cities, supported by forces from mainland Greece, challenged Persian authority. It was not a massive uprising in terms of scale, but it carried significance beyond its size. It revealed a problem. These were not populations that would simply integrate. They would resist. Darius responded as he always had, with precision, with force, with the intent to restore order. The revolt was suppressed. The cities brought back under control. The system reasserted. But the message had been delivered. The Greek world would not remain passive. And for an empire built on expansion, passivity from others is often assumed. Resistance must be addressed. Darius did not see the conflict as a single rebellion. He saw it as a challenge, not just to authority, but to the idea that Persia could extend its system indefinitely without opposition. The involvement of mainland Greek cities, though limited, was enough to shift the perception. This was no longer a regional issue. It was a developing conflict. The decision was made. Persia would move west, not simply to punish, but to establish control. The initial campaigns were measured. Expeditions tested the terrain, the conditions, the nature of the enemy. The Persian military, accustomed to structured opponents, now faced a different reality. Greek forces were smaller, but they fought with cohesion, with familiarity of their terrain, with a level of independence that made them difficult to predict. This was not an enemy that would collapse quickly. It would resist, and that resistance required adaptation. The Persian approach remained systematic. Armies were organized, supply lines established, movements coordinated. The scale of the empire allowed for resources that few could match. Yet scale alone does not guarantee victory. Because war is not only about numbers. It is about understanding. And the Greek world was not easily understood. City-states could unite when threatened and divide when the threat passed. Alliances shifted. Decisions were made collectively, debated, contested. This created delays but also resilience. Defeating one city did not end the conflict. Others remained, each with its own will, each with its own reasons to fight. The first major confrontations would begin to reveal this dynamic. Persian forces moved into regions that had not experienced such organized invasion before. Some submitted, others resisted. And in resistance, the tone of the conflict was set. This was not a campaign that would end quickly. It would become something larger. a struggle not just for territory, but for influence, for the ability of Persia to extend its system into a region that operated on entirely different principles. Darius, who had brought order to the empire, now faced a challenge that could not be solved by structure alone, because the Greek world did not function as a single system. It functioned as many, and those many would not yield easily. The war had begun, not with a single decisive battle, but with a shift, a movement from expansion into confrontation, from control into resistance. Persia had reached the edge of its system, and beyond that edge lay a different kind of world, one that would not be absorbed, one that would fight. And in that fight, the strength of the empire would be tested in ways it had never been before. Because this was not just another campaign. It was the beginning of a conflict that would define the limits of Persian power. Chapter 10. War with Greece begins. Empires expand until they meet resistance. For Persia, that resistance lay to the west. Beyond the vast systems of control, beyond the lands already absorbed into its structure, there existed a region unlike any it had encountered before. Not a unified kingdom, not a centralized empire, but a collection of city-states. Independent, divided, yet bound by something less visible and harder to control. Identity. The Greek world did not operate under a single authority. Each city had its own leadership, its own priorities, its own rivalries. They competed with one another, disagreed, conflicted. To an empire like Persia, this fragmentation might have seemed like weakness. But it was something else. It was unpredictability. And unpredictability is difficult to conquer. The connection between Persia and the Greek world had already begun through the Ionian cities along the coast of Asia Minor. These cities, though Greek in culture, had come under Persian control. At first, the arrangement followed the familiar pattern. Local structures remained, authority was extended, the system absorbed them. But not completely, because identity does not always adapt as easily as governance. The Ionian revolt marked the first clear sign of resistance. What began as unrest grew into open defiance. Greek cities, supported by forces from mainland Greece, challenged Persian authority. It was not a massive uprising in terms of scale, but it carried significance beyond its size. It revealed a problem. These were not populations that would simply integrate. They would resist. Darius responded as he always had, with precision, with force, with the intent to restore order. The revolt was suppressed. The cities brought back under control. The system reasserted. But the message had been delivered. The Greek world would not remain passive. And for an empire built on expansion, passivity from others is often assumed. Resistance must be addressed. Darius did not see the conflict as a single rebellion. He saw it as a challenge, not just to authority, but to the idea that Persia could extend its system indefinitely without opposition. The involvement of mainland Greek cities, though limited, was enough to shift the perception. This was no longer a regional issue. It was a developing conflict. The decision was made. Persia would move west, not simply to punish, but to establish control. The initial campaigns were measured. Expeditions tested the terrain, the conditions, the nature of the enemy. The Persian military, accustomed to structured opponents, now faced a different reality. Greek forces were smaller, but they fought with cohesion, with familiarity of their terrain, with a level of independence that made them difficult to predict. This was not an enemy that would collapse quickly. It would resist, and that resistance required adaptation. The Persian approach remained systematic. Armies were organized, supply lines established, movements coordinated. The scale of the empire allowed for resources that few could match. Yet scale alone does not guarantee victory, because war is not only about numbers. It is about understanding, and the Greek world was not easily understood. City-states could unite when threatened and divide when the threat passed. Alliances shifted. Decisions were made collectively, debated, contested. This created delays but also resilience. Defeating one city did not end the conflict. Others remained, each with its own will, each with its own reasons to fight. The first major confrontations would begin to reveal this dynamic. Persian forces moved into regions that had not experienced such organized invasion before. Some submitted, others resisted. And in resistance, the tone of the conflict was set. This was not a campaign that would end quickly. It would become something larger. A struggle not just for territory, but for influence, for the ability of Persia to extend its system into a region that operated on entirely different principles. Darius, who had brought order to the empire, now faced a challenge that could not be solved by structure alone, because the Greek world did not function as a single system. It functioned as many, and those many would not yield easily. The war had begun, not with a single decisive battle, but with a shift, a movement from expansion into confrontation, from control into resistance. Persia had reached the edge of its system, and beyond that edge lay a different kind of world, one that would not be absorbed, one that would fight. And in that fight, the strength of the empire would be tested in ways it had never been before. Because this was not just another campaign. It was the beginning of a conflict that would define the limits of Persian power. Chapter 11. Xerxes and the invasion of Greece. Empires do not forget defiance. They answer it. When Darius died, the conflict with the Greek world remained unfinished. The challenge had been identified, the resistance understood, but not resolved. The responsibility now passed to his successor. Xerxes. He inherited more than a throne. He inherited expectation, the weight of an empire that had grown vast and powerful, and the unfinished task of asserting that power over a region that had refused to submit. For Xerxes, the decision was clear. Greece would not remain beyond Persian control. But this would not be a minor campaign, not a measured expansion. What Xerxes prepared was something far greater. An invasion. Massive, deliberate, unavoidable. The scale alone was meant to overwhelm. Armies drawn from across the empire, representing its diversity, its reach, its strength. Infantry, cavalry, archers, engineers, each component organized, each part of a force designed to demonstrate that resistance was futile. This was not just strategy. It was statement. The movement toward Greece required preparation unlike anything before. Bridges were constructed across the Hellespont, linking continents. Supply lines were established to sustain the advancing army. The empire system, refined under Darius, now supported an operation of unprecedented scale. Everything was aligned. Everything was ready. The message was clear. Persia was coming. As the army moved forward, the Greek world faced a reality it could not ignore. City-states that had long competed with one another were forced to confront a common threat. Some chose submission, recognizing the overwhelming force approaching them. Others chose resistance, not because they expected easy victory, but because they refused to yield. This division would define the early stages of the conflict. But even among those who resisted, unity was fragile. Different cities, different priorities, different strategies. Coordination was difficult. Decisions required agreement. Time was limited. And yet they prepared. The first major stand came at Thermopylae, a narrow pass, A controlled point, a place where numbers could be reduced to advantage. Here, a smaller Greek force chose to face the advancing Persian army, not to win outright but to delay, to demonstrate that resistance was possible, to show that even against overwhelming odds, a stand could be made. The battle became symbolic, not because of its outcome, but because of its meaning. The Persian army advanced as expected. The scale of their force pressed forward, testing the defenses, pushing against the narrow terrain. The Greek resistance held, longer than anticipated, longer than logic might suggest. But inevitability remained. The pass was breached. The defenders were overcome. Thermopylae fell. From a strategic perspective, it was a Persian victory. But from another perspective, something had changed. The idea that Persia could not be resisted had been challenged. The invasion continued. Athens became the next focal point. The city, recognizing the approaching force, evacuated its population. What remained was not defense, but absence. Xerxes entered a city that did not fight in the way he might have expected. Athens was taken, burned, reduced to a symbol of consequence. It was meant to send a message. That resistance leads to destruction. That defiance has a cost. But messages are not always received in the way they are intended. Because while Athens fell, the conflict did not end. It shifted to the sea. Greek naval forces, understanding their limitations on land, concentrated their strength where they could create advantage. Narrow waters controlled movement, coordination over chaos. The Persian navy, though vast, faced difficulty in such conditions. And for the first time in the campaign, momentum slowed. The Battle of Salamis marked a turning point, not because it ended the war, but because it disrupted expectation. The Persian fleet, operating in confined space, could not fully utilize its size. Greek forces, smaller but coordinated, exploited this. Movement became restricted, command became more complex, and control began to slip. Losses followed, not catastrophic, but significant, enough to alter the perception of the campaign, enough to introduce uncertainty. Xerxes, faced with this shift, made a decision. He would not remain with the full force. Part of the army would continue, but the scale of the invasion would change. What had begun as an overwhelming advance was now becoming a prolonged conflict. The initial objective, swift domination, had not been achieved. Resistance had held, not completely, not decisively, but enough. The invasion of Greece had demonstrated the full power of the Persian Empire. Its reach, its organization, its ability to mobilize resources on an unprecedented scale. But it had also revealed something else. Limits. The empire could extend itself across continents. It could bring immense force to bear. But there were environments, conditions, and opponents that could challenge even that scale. The Greek world had not been absorbed. It had resisted. And in doing so, it had transformed the nature of the conflict. What had begun as expansion was now becoming something more complex. A struggle, not just for territory, but for control, for influence, for the boundaries of empire itself. Xerxes had brought Persia to the edge of dominance in the West, but he had not secured it. And in that gap, the next phase of the war would be decided. Because once momentum is broken, it does not easily return. Chapter 12. The Turning Point. Momentum, once lost, does not return easily. The invasion of Greece had begun with certainty, with scale, with the assumption that resistance, however determined, would eventually give way to overwhelming force. Persia had advanced across land and sea, demonstrating its power at every stage. But power, when stretched, begins to reveal its limits. After the clash at sea and the slowing of the campaign, the nature of the war had changed. What was once a direct path toward dominance had become uncertain, fragmented, and increasingly difficult to control. The empire still stood strong. Its armies were still vast. Its system still functioned. But the clarity that had defined its advance was gone. In its place was something far more dangerous: adaptation by the enemy. The Greek world, once divided and reactive, had begun to adjust. The initial shock of invasion had passed. What remained was determination, not uniform, not perfectly organized, but present and growing. City-states that had once acted alone began to recognize the necessity of coordination. Alliances strengthened. Strategies evolved. The realization took hold that survival depended not on individual action, but on collective resistance. This shift did not happen instantly, but it happened steadily. And that was enough. The Persian forces, though still powerful, were no longer facing isolated responses. They were facing a network of resistance, flexible, determined, and increasingly aware of its own potential. The battlefield moved again. Plataea, a wide plain, a different kind of engagement. Here, the confrontation returned to land, where Persian strength had always been clear. But this time, the conditions were not entirely in their favor. The Greek forces had learned from previous encounters. They understood the importance of position, of timing, of cohesion. They did not rush. They did not scatter. They held. The battle unfolded not as a sudden clash, but as a test of endurance. Movement, hesitation, adjustment. Both sides searching for advantage, for weakness, for the moment to act. And then it came. The engagement intensified. Lines met. Force met resistance. But this time, resistance did not break. The Greek forces, unified in purpose, maintained cohesion under pressure. Their formations held. Their coordination remained intact. The Persian army, though still formidable, began to lose the precision that had once defined it. Control weakened. Momentum shifted. And when momentum shifts in battle, it does not do so gradually. It turns. Plataea became more than a confrontation. It became a decision. The Persian forces were pushed back, not destroyed completely, but forced into retreat. The scale of their advance was no longer matched by control of the battlefield. The initiative, once firmly in their hands, had been taken. At the same time, at sea, another confrontation unfolded. Mycale, a coastal engagement, a continuation of the conflict that had already begun to change direction. Here, too, the Greek forces pressed their advantage. The Persian fleet, already weakened, faced coordinated opposition. The outcome reinforced what had begun at Plataea. The turning point was complete, not because Persia had been defeated entirely, but because the assumption of inevitability had been broken. The empire could be resisted. It could be challenged. And under the right conditions, it could be pushed back. This realization carried weight far beyond the battlefield. For Persia, it marked the end of expansion in this direction. The campaign that had begun with overwhelming force had not achieved its ultimate objective. The Greek world had not been absorbed. It had held its ground. For the Greeks, it marked something equally significant: confidence. The belief that unity, even among independent states, could stand against a larger power. That coordination, strategy, and determination could offset scale. This belief would shape everything that followed. The war did not end immediately. Conflicts would continue. Engagements would occur. But the direction had changed. The Persian Empire, still vast, still powerful, began to shift its focus inward, maintaining what it had become more important than extending further. The system that had been built needed stability, not constant expansion. And stability requires attention. The turning point was not a collapse. It was a limit, a moment where expansion met resistance strong enough to hold, where the reach of empire found its boundary, where power for the first time was forced to adapt rather than advance. This did not diminish what Persia had achieved. It redefined it, because an empire is not measured only by how far it grows, but by how it responds when growth stops. And for Persia, that response would determine not just its future, but its survival. The war with Greece had revealed something fundamental, that even the greatest systems have limits. And once those limits are reached, the next phase begins. Not expansion, but endurance. Chapter 13. The Slow Decline. Empires do not fall in a single moment. They diminish over time, often without clear notice. Their decline is rarely marked by a single decisive event, but rather by a gradual erosion of strength, a quiet weakening beneath the surface of apparent stability. After the great conflicts in the West, the Persian Empire remained immense in both size and influence. Its territories stretched across vast distances, encompassing diverse cultures, languages, and traditions. The administrative systems established under earlier rulers continued to function, and from an external perspective, the empire still appeared formidable. Yet within this structure, subtle changes had begun to take shape. The era of rapid expansion had ended. In its place came the challenge of preservation. Maintaining control over such a wide and varied empire required constant attention, careful governance, and the efficient management of resources. This phase demanded a different kind of leadership, one focused not on conquest, but on stability. Over time, maintaining cohesion across distant regions became increasingly difficult. Provincial governors, entrusted with authority, began to exercise greater independence. While they still operated within the framework of imperial rule, their growing autonomy created inconsistencies in administration. The central authority remained intact, but its influence was no longer as uniformly enforced as it had once been. Communication, despite the advanced systems in place, could not entirely overcome the challenges posed by distance. Messages required time to travel, and decisions were not always implemented with immediate precision. In these gaps, small issues emerged. Local disputes, economic imbalances, and administrative inefficiencies began to accumulate. Individually, such issues were manageable. Collectively, they placed increasing strain on the empire's structure. Rebellions, though not widespread, occurred with greater frequency. They tended to arise in regions where central control was weaker or where dissatisfaction had been allowed to grow. Each uprising required military response, drawing resources and attention away from other areas. While the empire possessed the strength to suppress these disturbances, the repeated need to do so gradually weakened its overall stability. The role of the military also began to shift. No longer primarily engaged in expansion, it became increasingly focused on maintaining internal order. This change altered its function within the empire. Instead of projecting power outward, it was now required to preserve it from within. At the center of the empire, leadership varied in effectiveness. Some rulers maintained continuity and stability, while others struggled to uphold the standards set by their predecessors. The consistency that had characterized earlier periods became less certain, and governance was increasingly influenced by court dynamics and internal politics. These developments did not result in immediate collapse. The Persian Empire remained a significant power, capable of asserting authority and maintaining its territorial integrity. However, the efficiency of its systems had begun to decline. Decision-making became less direct, and administrative processes grew more complex. Economically, trade and resource distribution continued, supported by the infrastructure established during earlier reigns. Yet a larger portion of these resources was now directed toward sustaining the empire rather than expanding it. The balance had shifted from growth to maintenance. This shift also influenced perception. While the empire remained strong, it no longer appeared as dynamic or as rapidly advancing as it once had. To external observers, it seemed more stable, but also more predictable. And predictability, in matters of power, can become a vulnerability. The Persian Empire had reached a stage of maturity. Its systems were extensive, its influence widespread, but the momentum that had driven its rise had diminished. What remained was the challenge of sustaining what had already been achieved. Decline in this context did not mean immediate failure. It meant gradual change, a movement away from expansion and toward preservation, from innovation toward repetition. The empire continued to function, but with increasing effort. Each generation faced the task of maintaining a structure that had become more complex than ever before, and with complexity came fragility. The slow decline of the Persian Empire was not defined by sudden loss, but by subtle transformation. It was a process shaped by time, by the accumulation of small weaknesses, and by the difficulty of sustaining vast systems across long periods. What had once been an era of growth and confidence had given way to one of careful balance and gradual uncertainty. The empire still stood, but it was no longer rising. And in history, that distinction often marks the beginning of the end. Chapter 14. Alexander and the Fall of Persia. The decline of an empire rarely goes unnoticed by those beyond its borders. While the Persian Empire continued to project an image of strength, its internal challenges had begun to alter the balance of power. Its systems, once precise and efficient, had grown less consistent. Its leadership, though still legitimate, no longer commanded the same unquestioned authority that had defined earlier generations. These changes did not immediately threaten the empire's existence. Persia remained vast, wealthy, and influential. Yet the conditions that had once ensured its dominance had shifted, and in that shift, opportunity emerged. To the west, the Greek world had undergone its own transformation. Where once there had been division and rivalry, there now existed a more unified force under the kingdom of Macedon. This unity provided a level of coordination and purpose that had previously been absent. It allowed for action on a scale that individual city-states could not sustain alone. At the center of this movement was Alexander, a ruler whose ambitions extended beyond regional control. He did not view Persia as an insurmountable power, but as a system that could be challenged. The idea of confronting the Persian Empire had existed for generations, shaped by earlier conflicts between Greece and Persia. What distinguished Alexander was his willingness to act decisively upon that idea. When he began his campaign eastward, he did so with a force that was smaller than the armies Persia had commanded at its height. However, his army was highly disciplined, experienced, and unified under a clear command structure. This cohesion would prove to be one of his greatest advantages. The first major engagement occurred at the Granicus River. Persian forces attempted to halt the advance at an early stage, using the terrain to their advantage. While their position was defensible, coordination among their ranks was limited. Alexander's forces, operating with greater unity and precision, were able to break through. The outcome was not merely a tactical victory, but an indication that Persian defenses could be overcome. Following this initial success, Alexander continued his advance without delay. This rapid progression prevented the Persian Empire from fully reorganizing its response. Each victory increased confidence within his ranks while simultaneously weakening the perception of Persian invulnerability. A more significant confrontation followed at Issus. This time, the Persian king himself led the army, bringing considerable resources and manpower to the battlefield. Despite this, the terrain restricted movement, limiting the effectiveness of the larger Persian force. Alexander's army maintained its cohesion, and through disciplined execution, secured another decisive victory. The consequences extended beyond the battlefield. The withdrawal of the Persian king altered perceptions of authority. What had once appeared stable now seemed uncertain. Confidence, an essential element of imperial control, began to diminish. Alexander continued to move through key regions, securing strategic locations and incorporating them into his growing domain. This systematic advance reduced Persia's ability to respond effectively, both militarily and administratively. The decisive moment came at Gaugamela. Here, the Persian Empire assembled its full strength in an effort to halt the advance. The battlefield was carefully selected to maximize the advantages of scale, and the army was drawn from across the empire. It represented the final concentrated effort to preserve Persian authority. The battle was intense and closely contested. For a time, both sides maintained their positions. However, the difference in coordination and leadership once again proved decisive. Alexander identified a weakness in the Persian formation and moved to exploit it. This action disrupted the structure of the opposing force. As the formation weakened, control diminished. The cohesion necessary to sustain resistance began to break down. When the Persian king withdrew, the remaining forces lost their central point of command. The result was not simply defeat, but disintegration. In the aftermath, the major capitals of the empire fell in succession. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, once centers of Persian authority, came under Alexander's control. In many cases, resistance was limited, reflecting the extent to which the empire's internal cohesion had already weakened. Although the Persian Empire ceased to exist as a unified political entity, its influence did not disappear. Alexander adopted aspects of its administrative structure, recognizing their effectiveness. This allowed for continuity in governance even as control shifted. The fall of Persia was therefore not solely the result of external conquest. It was the culmination of internal transformation, gradual decline, and the inability to respond effectively to a coordinated and determined opponent. What had once been the dominant power of the ancient world was replaced. Its territories became part of a new system, its structures adapted to serve a different authority. The empire itself had come to an end. But its legacy, its methods of governance, its approach to administration, and its model of large-scale rule continued to shape the world that followed. Chapter 15. Legacy of the Persian Empire. The fall of the Persian Empire marked the end of one of the most significant political structures of the ancient world. Its territories were absorbed into a new system, its rulers replaced, and its authority dissolved. Yet the disappearance of the empire as a political entity did not signify the end of its influence. On the contrary, many of its foundational ideas continued to shape the structures that followed. One of the most enduring aspects of the Persian Empire was its approach to governance. Unlike earlier models that relied heavily on uniformity, the Persians developed a system capable of managing vast and diverse regions. Different cultures, languages, and traditions were allowed to exist within a broader imperial framework. This balance between central authority and local autonomy proved highly effective and would later be adopted in various forms by subsequent empires. Administrative organization was another lasting contribution. The division of the empire into provinces, each governed by appointed officials, created a manageable structure for overseeing extensive territories. This system enabled consistent tax collection, law enforcement, and communication between the center and the periphery. Later powers would recognize the efficiency of this model and incorporate similar administrative divisions into their own governance. The infrastructure established under Persian rule also left a lasting impact. Roads that connected distant regions facilitated communication, trade, and military movement. These routes did not disappear with the fall of the empire. Instead, they continued to serve as vital connections for those who came after. The idea that an empire could maintain cohesion across large distances through organized infrastructure became an accepted principle of governance. Economic standardization further strengthened this legacy. The use of consistent systems for weights, measures, and currency allowed trade to function more efficiently across regions that had previously operated independently. This not only supported economic growth within the empire, but also influenced how later states approached commerce and regulation. Culturally, the Persian Empire demonstrated that large-scale political unity did not require the elimination of diversity. By permitting different religious practices and maintaining local traditions, the empire reduced resistance and encouraged stability. This pragmatic approach to cultural integration became an important reference for future rulers who faced similar challenges in governing diverse populations. The concept of kingship also evolved under Persian rule. The king was not only a military leader, but also a central figure responsible for maintaining order and justice across the empire. This broader understanding of leadership, which combined authority with administrative responsibility, contributed to later interpretations of imperial power. Even after its political decline, the Persian Empire continued to influence the structures that replaced it. Alexander, who brought an end to Persian rule, adopted many aspects of its administrative system. This ensured a degree of continuity, allowing governance to remain effective despite the change in leadership. Through this adaptation, Persian ideas were carried forward into new political contexts. The legacy of the Persian Empire can therefore be understood not as a static memory, but as an active influence. Its systems, methods, and principles persisted, shaping the development of future empires and contributing to the evolution of large-scale governance. In historical perspective, the importance of the Persian Empire lies not only in its size or its duration, but in its innovations. It demonstrated that complex and diverse societies could be organized under a single authority without complete cultural assimilation. It showed that infrastructure, administration, and economic standardization were essential components of sustained power. Although the empire itself came to an end, the ideas it introduced did not. They continued to evolve, to be adapted, and to influence the course of history long after Persian rule had ceased. The Persian Empire, therefore, did not simply disappear. It became part of the foundation upon which future civilizations were built.